section that may be of interest to you. From 1942 until the end of the war in 1945, I worked in the Air Ministry in London as one of Winston Churchill, or Winnie's, secretaries. Being a little old in the tooth these days, my memory is a little hazy. So please bear with me with the details, but I'll do my best to give you an accurate picture of those traumatic times and my role in them. In 1942, I was called up, but being married, they didn't send me into the forces. I remained a civilian working in the Air Ministry. At first, I was based in Holborn, not far from London Centre, in a small office as secretary to an Air Vice Marshal who had obviously been pulled out of retirement and at that time seemed very ancient to me. I think he was around 40, actually. Other members of his staff were also elderly. They were all nice to me, but I found the work very boring as he was in charge of getting rid of garbage, a job that was important in its own way, but hardly exciting to a young woman. After several months, my boss decided it wasn't fair to me to be in such elderly company. And so suggested that although he was very satisfied with my work, I should be sent elsewhere to a more suitable role. A lady in her 60s replaced me. Oh, really old, you know. I moved on to the temporary greener pastures of an Air Ministry typing pool. The pool was run by a lady called Mrs Woodruff, who seemed to me a rather straight-laced old thing, although she was probably actually only around 40. It soon became obvious that she didn't approve of me one bit. For one thing, being married, I certainly should not have been receiving phone calls or going out with any other men, particularly overseas servicemen, let alone calling out to the typing pool, would anyone like a free lunch with an American soldier or an Australian flyer or some such, when one of the overseas boys phoned me. Of course, my husband knew all about these lunches and was quite approving of them, but this didn't matter to Mrs W. In addition, though I say it myself, I was by far the best at setting out and typing up statistical data, which, with no computers then, had to be worked out manually. As most of the girls had no idea how to do this, they would ask for my help, the result being that Mrs W was quite insulted that she hadn't been asked instead of me. Obviously, she soon made up her mind to get rid of me ASAP. It seemed to us girls that if you admitted to not liking a certain type of work, then that's what you got. So we all became devious enough to say we didn't like what we actually most favoured. Therefore, with my overseer considering I disliked statistical typing, which I really loved doing, I was her prime choice for such a job when it became vacant, much to my delight. In my new position, I worked in a small office as assistant to a girl, Enid Berryman, bringing together important secret Air Force information regarding aircraft losses, missing kites and accidents for bomber coastal transport and fighter commands, and then transferring this information onto large statistical charts which the Air Ministry boffins could more easily analyse. With these being enormously complicated, with 4 typed written pages joined side by side, they needed to be perfectly set out, especially as they were also to be looked at every Friday by the Prime Minister, Winston Churchill. Everyone else seemed to think it would be the worst job to do in the entire world, except me. I loved the challenge, but I certainly told no one how I felt, or I would have lost the job, I'm sure, due to their strange attitude. In those days, security was surprisingly quite lax. The information that I was dealing with was top secret, and yet very few security measures were put in place to ensure the information remained that way. The enemy would have found this data enormously useful in strategic planning, and yet security wasn't stringent and no training was given in its importance. I could have taken it out of the building with no check on me as I left. The vital significance of this information to the enemy became evident to me after I'd been invited to a party by a girl in the typing pool by the name of Jennifer. Early on at the party, I got the feeling that they were attempting to get me drunk, so I became very wary. Every time they poured me a drink, I surreptitiously tipped it into the plant pot. The poor plant. After several drinks, I pretended that I was very tipsy and had had enough to drink. This is when the questions started regarding my job and the data I came in contact with. I attempted to make out that it wasn't important and I didn't have contact with anything of a vital nature, but the questions continued. After some time, I pretended that I was very sleepy and a bit drunk and needed to go home. As you can see, I was a very good actress then. The hosts were not in the least pleased by this. As I left the building, I took special note of the address, which I reported to the authorities the next day. I got the impression that the authorities thought I was a bit of a nut at first. You can understand that, can't you? But I managed to persuade them to take me seriously, dropping Winnie's name as much as I could. In the end, they accompanied me to the building. Later, several people from the party were taken into custody and it was found that they were part of a spy ring that passed information on to the enemy. Ooh, wow. My colleague Jennifer, however, in spite of this, continued to work at the Air Ministry for the remainder of the war. After hostilities had ceased in 1945, we found out that Jennifer's grandmother was German, so Jennifer may well have been passing information on to the enemy throughout the war. Security was certainly very lax indeed to ignore such a connection. After several weeks of working in my role of compiling statistical data, I'm proud to say that Mr Churchill asked the boss of my section, Mr Hutt, to tell him who did such an excellent job. And when he replied, "My dear little girl," Mr Churchill said he'd like to meet his dear little girl, which he did, being very gracious and kind to me. I was truly amazed that such a busy man involved in such important work could bother to even meet me and compliment me. It was certainly a very big thrill, as you can imagine. From this time on, the Prime Minister often asked Mr Hutt to give his regards to that dear little girl. You can see how I've changed, can't you? Real popular. After working with Berry for a while, she was transferred to the job of Secretary to the woman who managed all the Air Ministry typing pools and other female secretarial staff, and I was given Berry's job with my own assistant, a girl by the name of Gwen, a very efficient worker who actually remained a close friend of mine for the rest of her life until she died in 2008. I recall how we were continuously checked on by a stamp-sized hole that had been scraped into the coloured glass of the door. Often we would see an eye being applied from the corridor side. Of course, we responded by putting our fingers to our noses with a rather rude whack, then sticking a label over the space which ended that spot of spying. They could hardly complain, so once more we got away with our attitude to their stupid authority. We were pretty cheeky in doing so, I suppose. There was a shortage of small rooms in the building, so much to our disgust, we were suddenly told we'd have to work in a corner of the typing pool so that a group captain could take over our room. We were pretty upset about it, as the work was all top secret and had to be typed up on a double brief carriage. This meant that up until then, at the times of a special bad air raids, we had been able to leave our work, lock the room and take cover downstairs. But now we will be unable to do this. Instead, every time there was an air raid, which was frequently, the typing had to be taken out of the machine and put into the locked safe with the almost impossible task of getting it back into place again once the raid was over. We therefore decided to stay put during the bombing and risk it, until one day we received a notice to say that we had to comply with the rules and go down to a safer area at once in large letters every time the alarm sounded. We decided we would do it for a time, and then when we could once more get away with it, we would return to our former wicked ways. On this particular occasion, we just reached the bottom of the stairs to take cover when the all clear sounded, so we weren't too pleased, thinking stopping the work had really been very unnecessary indeed. On re-entering our room, however, Gwen and I stopped in our tracks. I normally sat at a desk with a window behind me. In this raid, the heavy glass from the window had been well and truly smashed, with a large spear of glass embedded in my desk in front of my typewriter, just like a dagger. It would have passed through the area where I would have been sitting, and indeed where I'd sat on every previous occasion until today, straight into my back. How fortunate it was that for once I'd heeded Air Ministry protocol. That young duck would never have had the chance to become this old duck. Still, not being happy about losing our rooms, I wasn't over enamoured at being asked by Mr Hutt if I would mind taking some letters in shorthand from the group captain who had ousted us. There were very few girls who were shorthand writers, being only straightforward typists, so I had to say yes. Maybe I was disgruntled by this, but I felt absolutely furious when I entered the room to find the group captain laying back in my old chair with his feet on my old desk and rudely indicating for me to sit down by a wave of the hand without even a word of greeting. So I told him if that was his attitude, he could write his own letters. And I stormed out to tell Mr Hutt of my disgust at his manner of business. Mr Hutt was also upset and told the group captain off, saying that if he treated me like that again, he'd see he was moved. Mr Hutt told the officer that I was a favourite of the Prime Minister, which wasn't strictly true, of course, but although I'd been favourably noticed by the Prime Minister, it was certainly something to be proud of. Telling the man I was a favourite was a little over-exaggerated. However, it seemed to do the trick, and the group captain apologised to me, telling me he was used to dealing with waffs and treating them in this office. As you know, Britain was greatly cheered by Churchill's famous words aimed at the brave boys who guarded our shores in fighter planes. Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few. This statement has gone down in history and was well deserved by these super flyers, many of them killed at a young age, but with others always willing to take their place. I was proud to meet many of these gallant young men whilst in the Air Ministry. Some put into office jobs while recovering from injury were always great fun to talk to, and I remember one in particular who wrote poems as I did, so we exchanged efforts each morning. Unfortunately, on returning to duty, which he insisted on, in spite of having a metal leg replacement, he was killed in a dogfight, keeping German planes at bay. Such a sad loss of a lovely man and talent, which really hit home to me. Other poor boys I met had been badly burned or who had missing limbs, so many who made it back made great sacrifices which they lived with for the remainder of their years. Sacrifice was absolutely everywhere, as so many of us here today know. Another particularly sad part of my Air Ministry job was finding the names of friends in the fatality lists or the missing in action list. This was always a horrible shock and I never really got used to. In December 1944, a month after my mother had suddenly passed away, I not only found the name of a very good Canadian fighter pilot friend of mine, Bill Irwin, but also the name of my Lawrence. When I first found out that he and all his crew were missing in action, we didn't know if they'd all been killed or had been captured. Our presumption was that as his kite had been seen in flames, descending in a spiral and crashing in a blaze of fire, that all aboard had been killed. It was a number of months before we found out that only his pilot, Flying Officer Ron Fjellberg, had been killed in the crash, and the remainder had been taken prisoner right in the middle of what the Americans called the Battle of the Bulge, because they'd been able to get out of the plane because of the way the pilot had kept in it, and only 2 miles from friendly territory. Lawrence spent the remainder of the war as a prisoner of war, although he attempted to escape twice while in the Long March. Unfortunately, neither attempt was successful and ended in reprisals by his captors. As you can imagine, December 1944 was a very sad time for our family, but that's another story, so you may need to wait for the release of the book my husband and daughter have written about these experiences. That's a good plug, isn't it, Tiana? It's still a year or 2 off being published, so we have to keep you all posted on that one. Anyway, I believe my allotted time here is up, so I'd like to thank you all for inviting me here today and look forward to talking to you more at lunchtime. That's if you could bear it. If you have any questions regarding my experiences, please feel free to ask. Although I should add, my memory these days is affected by the onset of Alzheimer's, so I may not be able to personally answer you. Luckily, I have a daughter who has heard my tales many times, so I'm sure she will assist with any details that I've forgotten, if you care to ask her. Thank you again for this invitation, and I look forward to chatting to you later, if you so desire.
Thank you, Mr Hickey and Mrs Adair. Truly wonderful. And thank you very much for sharing with us your perspective of Bomber Command. Ladies and gentlemen, it is now time to lay wreaths in honour of the Airmen of Bomber Command. What we're going to do is, as I call you forward, the WOD will point you to either the left or the right hand side